Now, John is going to talk his talk today to the title, Can Diplomacy Prevent a Longer War in Ukraine? Quite a challenge, I must say. It's very depressing, isn't it, that we've now been going for, I've forgotten now, almost 100 days or over 100 days.
Over 100 days, yeah.
14, almost 14 weeks today since the war, the hostilities began. And here we are having to be so defensive, or having to work out how to cope. So we're very pleased that he's visiting us yet again. He's been to see us physically at the Northcourt Centre a few times. He introduced his book, The Glorious Art of Peace, when it just came out, the first edition, and now I believe it's into a second edition. Hi, Annette. So off we go, if you're
okay.
willing.
Thank you. I'm ready to go. Yeah. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And what actually happens is that you stimulate me to thinking a bit more deeply and delving a bit more widely into the subject. Because until fairly recently, some of you may know I'm by sort of origin, I'm a China specialist. Until fairly recently, I've been concentrating on looking at China's policy on Ukraine, the relationship between President Xi and Putin, and trying to, which is very ambiguous. The whole thing is very ambiguous, and trying to figure it out. And more than that, trying to persuade people who might have some connections in China, whether they're academic or otherwise, to say to the Chinese, for goodness sake, get off the fence, which is where they basically are. And that's all important. I could talk about that, but that's not what I'm going to talk. You can ask me about that if you like, but that's only one part of the big, possibly diplomatic picture. Of course, in this country, reading only the British media, you wouldn't know that there's such a thing as diplomacy, Ukraine war diplomacy, because all we hear is Liz Truss saying the war is going to go on until Russia's defeated, and Boris Johnson, he got in there very early, about a month ago, saying the war will go on at least to the end of next year, and now he says it's going on even longer. And there is no discussion, I'm sorry to say, in this country that I've come across, no serious discussion. But delving around, as I say, I'm happy, or somewhat happy, to say that the issue is a live one, and there are ideas out there, and there is something to explore, and something for me to talk about. I'd like to start off with just a historical digression. It's not actually a digression, it's very relevant. And with a quotation from Georges Clemenceau, who was the French Prime Minister at the end of the First World War. He said something which has often been repeated, which is, it is easier to make war than to make peace. I think he was talking mainly about the difficulty of negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, but actually what he said was very pertinent to the First World War. It so happens I've been reading this book by an American historian called Philip Zelikow, called The Road Less Traveled, and the subtitle is The Secret Battle to End the Great War, 1916 to 17. He's the first historian to write a whole book on the subject that others have looked at. The attempts which were made 2 years before the Great War actually ended to bring it to a close. And this is his conclusion. Had the war stopped in 1916, it would have given way to a scarred and bitter peace, but the outlook would have been better. As in a patient ravaged by illness, every further year of terrible warfare lowered the world's odds for a healthy recovery. And actually that medical metaphor is more apt than he might have thought when he was writing the book 2 or 3 years ago, because one of the consequences of more years of terrible warfare, apart from the deaths of I haven't quite figured it out, at least 1 million more, but I think probably 2 million more than if the war had stopped then. One of the consequences was the so-called Spanish flu pandemic, which may have started in the trenches, but certainly was spread very fast by soldiers and refugees returning home. Well, it's a fascinating story, which I won't go into. I mean, the people who were talking about trying to get peace then were Lloyd George, just before he became Prime Minister himself, when he changed his tune and became wanted to show himself as a war leader. Chancellor Bethmann, who was the German Chancellor and the German ambassador in Washington. Pope Benedict played an important part, and most of all, President Wilson. And the reasons why this failed, well, there are several reasons, which I won't go into. But it could have happened. And so thinking a bit further on other wars which could have ended earlier, you may say World War II could not have ended earlier, but certainly if you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the ongoing debate about whether it was necessary to use nuclear weapons, whether that war could not, or Japan could not have been brought to close another way. Korean War, when the decision by General MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel and go north, prolonged the war by two years, probably, and certainly 1.5 million more deaths. The first Vietnam War, I don't know if any of you heard a program by Douglas Hurd, a repeat of a program by Douglas Hurd, talking about the Geneva Conference in 1954, ended the first Vietnam War. That's the French War. When he said, Douglas Hurd, the former British Foreign Secretary, said very, very casually, we were very close to a nuclear war then, which is not what we were really told. That's the French. That war could certainly have ended, shouldn't have begun. The second Vietnam War, the American war in Vietnam, was prolonged by Nixon for his own political reasons. You can extend this to look at Afghan wars in Iraq and so on. So the war we're faced with today is likely to inflict further disaster on civilians, more casualties, more deaths, to prolong the disastrous effect upon the world economy and particularly on food supply to poorer nations. It's fairly obvious that we do want to try to find a way to bring it to a halt. Now, there are two reasons why it seems to me the two obstacles one comes up against, which they came up against in 1916, 1917 during the First World War. The first is a reluctance to stop fighting when you think you are waging a just cause, and also when you wish to make good the losses you have already sustained. That's certainly a very powerful motive for the Ukrainians who want to continue fighting. And the second, which is rather, and that is understandable. I think we have to accept. A lot of Ukrainians, by no means more, a lot of Ukrainians really feel that once having been, they didn't start the war, but it's been inflicted upon them, they want to win it. One can understand that. The second factor, which is rather more malign, is the way in which people who are, I won't say they're warmongers, but they're certainly committed to war. You might even say they're keen on war, hitch themselves to the wagon. So you have a coalition of right-wingers backing, and Boris Johnson is a very good example of this, although he's doing it entirely for domestic political reasons. But you have right-wing opinion which is committed to war to the end, of the defeat, if not the defeat of communism, the defeat of Russia. Incidentally, bizarrely, the United States is at the same time continuing to define China as an even greater threat than Russia. And many American pundits talk about China as if it is a communist country, which is laughably isn't. So that old Cold War trope, the defeat of communism, somehow is still knocking around, even if communism has become Putinism. So what are people saying outside, beyond Liz Truss and Boris Johnson? What are people saying about how to stop the war, which is worth us looking at and taking note of? I'll start with, I'll just look at the last week. I just went back over the last week to see what various people have said. And I started with the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who on the 12th of June said that we are giving military aid to Ukraine to strengthen their hand at the negotiating table when they, hopefully soon, will sit there and negotiate the peace agreement. That's good. That's definitely good. And then on the 18th of June, that's 6 days later, he, in a newspaper interview, he said, we must not let up in supporting Ukraine. We must prepare for the fact that it could take years. Now, I wish we had Jens Stoltenberg to ask him to reconcile those two statements. But I think it does show something of the mental confusion, which, the people who are actually in charge, they themselves have about the situation that we're in. So that's Jens Stoltenberg. Then some of you may observe, because it has been reported, not very prominently, Macron and the new German Chancellor Scholz take a very different view from the British government, and they are talking about and have been talking about negotiations. And back at the end of May, they both urged Vladimir Putin to hold direct and serious negotiations. And then when they went to Kyiv again last week, it rather looks as if they were discussing that with Zelensky, although it didn't appear publicly. Ukrainians who believe that Europe is faint-hearted have a rather derisive term for people who lack courage. And they say that they are Macroning. And again, as I said, you have to accept that, the point of view of many Ukrainians, any talk of negotiations, any talk of peace is at this stage, it undermines them. But I'll go on to, quote the chief Ukrainian negotiator. And I must admit, until I did this trawling around, I wasn't even aware of his name. His name is David Arakhamia. And he was in Washington last week, and he gave a couple of very interesting interviews, one with an online company called Axios, a website, and the other with the Voice of America. And this is what he said. While formal negotiations are frozen, Arakhamia said he and his team speak by phone with their Russian counterparts 1 or 2 times per week to check in, even though both sides clearly realize that right now, there's no place for negotiation. He said that there was domestic backlash, he means in Ukraine, to the idea of negotiating with Russia at all after the alleged war crimes in cities like Bucha and Mariupol, But he also noted that the war would have to end through compromise. And David Arakhamia, the chief Ukrainian negotiator, then went on to tell the Voice of America that they have a plan, and the plan is to resume negotiations in August after what he called the counterattack. So you see, we do have something to go on. We have to get our heads around this, and I would like to see diplomatic correspondents of my former newspaper, The Guardian, and elsewhere, get their teeth into this and talk to people in a way that I'm unable to do, and try to find out the substance behind these contradictory statements. But if we try to construct a timeline, a very rough timeline, if you go back to March and part of April, you will recall that there were negotiations taking place between Russia and Ukraine. There were also bilateral approaches by Turkey, by Israel, by Macron himself, of course, and by other leaders to Putin. There was some discussion going on between the British and other partners too. There was quite a lot happening in that. That was in March and April. And then, as Arakhamia said, I think two things happened in sort of late April into May. First of all, you had Bucha, and you had the revelations about Russian war crimes, and I just don't buy into any of the conspiracy theories put up by the Russians. They were war crimes. They are war crimes. The Russian soldiers were very poorly trained, and they behaved extremely badly, and that horrified. Then you had the Russian retreat from Kyiv, or the retreat from their attempt to advance into Kyiv. So the combination of those two, outrage at the atrocities and a feeling the Russians were on the defensive because they were withdrawing from the Kyiv area, I think encouraged the Ukrainians and their Western backers to think to sort of put the negotiation track on ice, particularly since the various overtures they'd made to Putin were getting nowhere at all. Or of course, we don't know the detail of that. That's why I say we'd like to know much more detail. So you had this optimism, fairly brief optimism since sort of May. Well, maybe the Ukrainians can win the war after all. Now, late May into June, we are getting pessimism disguised as optimism, or just pessimism. Rather depends who you listen to. I was very struck by the reports from from Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's wonderful Middle East editor, who, when he arrived in and around the Donbass, he started reporting, and this was like a month ago, the Ukrainians are going to lose this area. They are on the defensive. They are losing. And Ukraine, sort of bit by bit, is having to admit that. On the other hand, there's this other there's this sort of totally opposite narrative to which the Arakhamia, the Ukrainian negotiator, referred, the belief that, okay, so they may be on the defensive now, but they're going to launch a counterattack with the new weaponry they're getting from NATO, from the West. And the counterattack is going to be successful, or at least successful enough to regain enough territory so that in August they can start negotiations. Anything can happen. That, I think myself, it's unlikely that counterattack, if they manage to launch it, is going to reverse the incremental, brutal but incremental gain of Russia, leaving them in a worse situation as time goes on, which of course brings me back to the point that it's better to try to make peace earlier than later. Well, what kind of peace? How can you make it? Because the issues are there. They're pretty, one can identify them pretty easily. and there appears to be an irreconcilable conflict of interests between Russia and Ukraine, and between those who support Russia and those who support Ukraine. So let's move on now to, I'm going to move on now just to think a little bit about what kind of deal might possibly be constructed. And here again, in a way, there's more to go on than you might think, although it's not a topic being discussed very much around here. This morning, by the way, I just happened to see that Al Jazeera ran yesterday a 20-minute discussion on the subject. The title was, "Can Diplomacy End the War in Ukraine?" Al Jazeera, by the way, if you want to get a good feeling for what's happening in Ukraine, I would strongly recommend Al Jazeera. I mean, they're very on many issues, but on this in particular. And they had somebody from Moscow, and they had somebody from Ukraine, and they had international affairs experts looking at all the different possibilities. Not very hopefully, and they were all saying we can't at the moment. There are no prospects, but there could be something down the road. And again, that's the sort of discussion which I would like to see Panorama having, or some other news magazine program. And I would like to see British newspapers, devoting a whole page spread to the Guardian long read to the issue, what kind of peace could be achieved in Ukraine. So, delving around, as I say, I found a few things which I think are relevant, which I'd like to share with you. First of all, it's a report there's not very much, but it's mostly in the American media, and the American media, parts of it are really good, better than ours. So here's a report from CNN, just what, a couple of weeks ago. And this is what it says. They said, confronted with the risk of a protracted deadlock in Ukraine, the United States has been conducting regular meetings with the United Kingdom and other allies to find a potential framework for a ceasefire in war-ravaged Ukraine. According to the report, a 4-point peace plan suggested recently by Italy has been among the topics of discussion. Let me pause a moment. Is there anyone listening to me who was aware that there was a 4-point Italian peace plan?
No.
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 Oh, Richard.
Yeah, well done. Yes? Yes, one person. Good. Well, could I pause while he tells us how he knows about it?
The reason I know about it is, well, one of the papers I read is Le Monde Diplomatique.
Yeah.
And I know through that and other sources which might be called, what shall I say, rather radical minority left magazines in this country, which also reported that Italy went along with Macron and Olaf Scholz on the visit to Ukraine. Yeah,
good. Well, I'm glad they, whether they're minority or not, I'm very glad they picked it up. But if you read the majority media, you wouldn't know. You would have known. So this plan, in fact, was put, and this is also interesting too. Italy, Conte, I get confused by which prime minister it is. I think it's Conte. He put it to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who's the right person to put it to. The UN should be involved. I'll say something about that later, in a moment. And here, this is the plan. The first step is a ceasefire. Let me pause there for a moment. Who has called for a ceasefire? Well, actually, rather oddly, last month, Lloyd Austin, the American Secretary of Defense, had a conversation with the Russian defense minister, and he called for an immediate ceasefire. And we heard nothing more about it. As far as I can tell, the Americans never repeated that call. Who else? China and India had a foreign ministers meeting, again in May, early May, is that right? Late April. And they called for an immediate ceasefire too. Once again, we've heard nothing more about it. The Chinese haven't repeated the call, the Indians haven't repeated the call. So I'm just laying those out without commenting on them. But you know, people do call for an immediate ceasefire. And in a way, right at the beginning, when there was that overwhelming vote in the General Assembly condemning Russia, I can't remember whether it actually explicitly called for a ceasefire, but the implication was there should be a ceasefire. So that's the first. The first step is to get a ceasefire and the demilitarization of the front lines. Well, if you're going to demilitarize front lines, you're going to have, I don't know if the plan says this or not, because we only have the bare outline. If you're going to demilitarize the front line, you're going to have to put something between the two sides. And that is where the UN peacekeeping force would fit the bill and add that thought. That's the first step. Second point is that Ukraine will be a neutral country with its security guaranteed by a not yet identified group of countries. The contours of this part of the plan would be discussed at a peace conference. Now, that takes me back to the discussions, which I think I may mention, did take place fairly early on, in which Britain was involved. And I think even Britain talked about it with China too. And the Chinese certainly talked about it with other Western countries, which is discussion about the kind of security guarantees you would give to Ukraine. And so you could imagine, you know, a package of a group of guarantors, you know, ideally would range from China to the United States, but well, obviously with Germany, Italy, and France, and hopefully more. Turkey, of course, has been quite active in such talks that have taken place. So that's the second point, that you guarantee Ukraine's neutrality by security guarantees. The third point, and here we get to the really difficult bit, is a bilateral agreement between Russia and Ukraine to clarify the future of Crimea and Donbass. Now, Zelensky early on indicated that he was prepared to make concessions on Crimea, but not on Donbass. But this is an incredibly complex area. The agreement would deal with cultural and language rights and guarantee the free movement of people, goods, and capital. Crimea and Donbass would have almost complete autonomy, including on questions of defense, but would be part of Ukraine. You can imagine an agreement where there'd be a sort of nominal agreement that they were still part of Ukraine, but acceptance of the de facto reality that they're not. And there's even been some, I thought somewhere else, a suggestion that you would have a 15-year moratorium on determining the final status of these areas. And I think I'm right in saying that sorry. And there's an example where that's happened. I can't remember what it was. And there are other issues, of course, language, guarantees that the Russian and Ukrainian language should have parity, and so on. The fourth point would be a multilateral peace agreement between the European Union and Russia. Doesn't mention NATO. European Union and Russia. That would include a staged withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine and the winding down of Western sanctions against Moscow. Well, there are all sorts of things you could add to this or subtract from it, and no doubt in the discussions which have taken place, we're told that it have taken, we're told in that CNA report they are still taking place, a lot of detail has gone into, and if they, an eventual agreement could well run to hundreds and hundreds of pages. And of course, achieving peace in a situation where neither side has won is actually even more difficult, because there's no victor who can impose terms on the vanquished.
Yeah.
Which is just as well, you may say. Looking at my countdown here, so I'm getting to the end. Where does this leave us? I mean, clearly we need to get our heads around all this detail. At the risk of being sort of befuddled by it, we do have to try to, and particularly since other people are not doing so, we have to do it. So the points I've jotted down at the end. Why are we not talking more about this? I think we have to talk more about it. Danger that low visibility means low likelihood of anything happening. That's also true, I think, that the less we talk about it, or the less that our leaders, our politicians talk about it, the less likelihood is that there's any commitment to doing anything about it. So anybody, the back street, that's right, the back door negotiations, backtrack, the second track negotiations, and so on, have to have a public support or political support. So it is important that our governments don't tell us that this is a war that can be won, or that the only solution is the defeat of Putin. It's important that they say, as from time to time, even the Secretary General of NATO says, there has to be a negotiated solution, and we're working on it, they might say. So I think if we were told there has to be a negotiated solution, we are working on it, things not ripe at the moment, but we want to get that point as soon as we can. That would be a better prospect than where we are now. How can we as individuals or in the peace movement do anything about this? I mean, I have a feeling that we are, I think demoralized is too strong a word, but we are rather stunned by the Ukraine war, stunned almost into silence, in the sense we don't really have anything very coherent to say, except we're against war. Well, as I've said before, in various ways, I think we have to back the United Nations and urge anybody we can to back the United Nations. If you remember, the UN Secretary General went to Kyiv, went to Moscow, he came back, that was in May, and everybody said, oh, it's a failure, that just shows the UN is hopeless. It's only hopeless, it's feeble, it's only hopeless and feeble and a failure if it doesn't get any support. He had no support at all when he went on that mission to Moscow and Kyiv. No government issued a statement, as they should have done, saying we support the Secretary General. And consequently, he came back. But he did come back with an agreement on getting people out of Mariupol. That was all he came back with. He had to be satisfied with that. He came back and came to the conclusion that nothing much I can do at the moment. But that would change if he had the support. So I think we have to urge our politicians in every way we can to involve the United Nations, and also to discuss this issue. The House of Commons should have an emergency debate on how to end the war in Ukraine. And that debate should not just be Tom Tugendhat and people like that saying we have to back the Ukraine to the hilt. what the Russians are doing is appalling, which of course it is, and we cannot be faint-hearted. As I said at the beginning, one cannot simply allow the people who are sort of predisposed towards seeing war as the only solution to put it forward as the only solution. At least we, or others, have to put forward an alternative. So in the Labour Party and Lib Dems, and I would like to maybe talk to Layla Moran about this, need to have our own program, alternative to continued war with no prospect of an end to it. And I haven't even mentioned the dangers which of nuclear escalation. I'll just conclude by pointing out the irony that back at the beginning of this year, if you recall, the 5 major nuclear powers issued a statement, a joint statement, saying that nuclear war cannot be won. And I think they issued that statement because they were rather panicked by the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. They were rather panicked by it. Anyhow, they said a nuclear war cannot be won. And then sort of 4 or 5 months later, people are quite calmly talking about the possibility. You turn on the radio, turn on Radio 4, and you happen to come in on a discussion on the Today program or somewhere. What are the prospects of nuclear war as a result over Ukraine? I mean, it's just amazing that we've reached the situation so quickly of accepting the possibility, and then people say, well, you can't quantify it, or maybe it's not so great as all that. Just to discuss it. It's quite amazing, and it's certainly a reason why we should try to ginger up anybody we can ginger up into taking negotiations and the idea of a peace settlement seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, John. And it's quite clear that you don't believe it's just a matter for the diplomats and the leaders. It's a matter for us to bring some pressure to bear on them. And I think that's very important for members of the putatively popular peace movement. So, yeah, that's great. Are there any questions that anybody has ready, would like to ask now? Let's take a few questions and then have some more discussion if you like. Any questions? Okay, Richard. Yes, fire away. Your mic's on. Very good.
Okay, thank you. I've got to go shortly. I'm sorry, Mike. Apologies to you and to John Gittings for this. But what I wanted to ask is, the problem as I see it that we have as ordinary people is trying to get through to government and even to Parliament. I don't believe that government, which is basically set in an imperial mindset and believes that we are superior to all others in terms of, well, both warfare and in our logic, is going to change its mind voluntarily. I like your idea of having a debate in Parliament, but I fear that the loyal opposition will be exactly that, loyal and not an opposition, with certain honourable exceptions. And I wonder how we get through that, and also what you talked about earlier, the media fog over all this. I'd like to know any ideas, please.
Well, I mean, I think you're right about the government. If by the government you mean the Conservative government. Nothing doing there. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 people, but we might find, but basically nothing doing. So we're talking about how to get what you call the loyal opposition to be a bit less loyal on this issue. and be prepared to, not to be scared of headlines in the Daily Mail saying, Labour wants to appease Putin or something like that. And the only way of avoiding the impression that you are advocating appeasement, and of course there have been quite a few comparisons with appeasement before the Second World War, that'll be used. The Tom Tukin hats and so on will use that. The only way of avoiding that is to be well prepared with very specific proposals. That's why I think they have to do their homework. But like Lisa Nandy, those who are Labour Party members should be writing to Lisa Nandy and asking her to address this seriously. And isn't our MD, isn't Leila Moran the Lib Dem Foreign Affairs spokesperson? And then she too. There are so many other issues here, but these have to be taken on board. So be well prepared, have something concrete to propose, and look for allies elsewhere. As I indicate, there are allies elsewhere. Of course, I'm well aware that to suggest that we might have something in common with Macron or Scholz or any other member of the EU is not going to go down well with the Daily Mail. But we have to take the consequences.
Well, if the striking railwaymen can stand up to the Daily Mail, can't we?
That is very true. Yeah, very true. By the way, it's quite irrelevant, but Paul Dacre, the suggestion I saw on a tweet from Alistair Campbell is that Paul Dacre is going to be made a lord. Anyhow, no, they will. Of course, one might remind the Mail of their position at the time of appeasement.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So
how does anyone get pressure to bear on the United Nations? I mean,
yeah, this is difficult, you see, because as I say, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, had such a difficult time when he went to Moscow and when he went to Kyiv that he hasn't precisely given up. And actually his speeches, which don't get reported, he makes some very good speeches about the dangers we're facing on nuclear weapons, by the way, many climate change and also Ukraine. But he's not putting anything forward at the moment. I was advocating, and some of you may have heard me advocating, that people should join the United Nations Association in this country and use them as a vehicle. But I have to say that having urged people to join, I've so far been unsuccessful in getting any response to my own personal approaches, suggesting that the United Nations Association UK should actually be proactive in putting forward ideas on how the United Nations could become involved. I've mentioned peacekeeping. That is something which needs a lot of discussion. You don't just suddenly find peacekeepers. So in the past, there have been cases where there's a need for peacekeepers and it's been very, very hard to find them, or sometimes where countries have committed themselves in advance, so it's worked rather better. Countries could commit themselves in advance to contribute to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. It's just one area. The rank and file membership of the General Assembly could take this on board. It may only be resolutions, but a resolution from a large majority of the United Nations calling for a ceasefire and negotiations. It would be symbolic, but it hasn't happened yet. That would be something as well. So there are things which one could do, which could be done. I'm not suggesting we can do them, but we can urge them. We have to combat the feeling that we'd just like it all to go away, and There's too much.
So is a peace group associated with the United Nations? How do we link in to United Nations and make ourselves felt?
Well, as I say, there's the UNA, United Nations Association, should be the channel. There are, of course, NGOs who are very much involved with the disarmament process at the United Nations, and of course, were very influential in getting the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons passed. So there are substantial NGO. There is a substantial NGO presence in the United Nations. It tends to be clustered around the disarmament committees. There's not a Ukraine war committee. It's a bit harder. There's no formal structure there. That is something where I think one would have to consult somebody with expertise who's worked in the United Nations. Rachel, sorry, I'm bad on names, but she said, well, I think she's even talked to, hasn't she? Rachel, Rebecca Johnson. Rebecca Johnson. Yeah. One could consult Rebecca Johnson and say, how can, you've been very successful in getting the issue of nuclear weapons high on the agenda and getting member states to actually to grapple with it. Can you suggest ways, procedures, mechanisms through which one could do the same for the ending the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
Have you had Rebecca Johnson talk to you?
Yes, we certainly have.
Well, you have, yeah.
I would like to say that the core of the problem is, that all of the destruction on the Russians' part is that we're all fueling, or we're all giving the resources to them to do so. I mean, you said earlier on that both Japan and India, after a ceasefire, I mean, they're the biggest, they're certainly contributing to the resources and everything that's going on, because they're purchasing such an awful lot of fuel for them. And the same with Germany. Goodness me, the whole world is really dependent on Russia. And that's the core of the problem. There is the destruction, which very few of us ever, actually even talked about Syria. But they were able to go in there and destroy part of the country there and leaving all that destruction without a dent in their ammunition and everything. So, that is a major problem. And I think that that's the reason why they're saying that it's going to go on for years, because it's going to take years for the countries to be more independent of Russia with regards to their fuel. And when you look at Ukraine,
I'm sorry, we've rather lost you.
To Europe, when Russia had threatened in Ukraine to cut off their fuel into Europe, there was an outcry. Now that was the time really when Europe, the heads of states could have got together and gave them some time to realize their dependency on them.
Well, I mean, of course, we haven't actually discussed this yet, but basically what you're saying is we have to consider Russia. And it's quite true. Everything I've said has been about how we deal with it. Russia's sort of over there. And analyzing the various Russian position, that's incredibly complex too. I mean, you have, and there are sort of political, there's some politics in this. You may you know, there are those who well, they blame it on NATO expansion. But really what they're doing there, if you say it's just down to NATO expansion, in a way you are conceding the whole idea that the world is divided into spheres of influence. There's an American political scientist, John Mearsheimer, who's quoted quite often, quoted by the Russians, by the Chinese, and by left-wing critics of the support for Ukraine, because he says that, in effect, you know, we brought it on, NATO brought it on by expanding. So what he's saying is Russia is entitled to a sphere of influence in Central Europe, and we should have realized that and left things alone. And then he goes on to say, and I saw him being interviewed just a couple of days ago, he said just in the same way that America is entitled to a sphere of influence in Central America, and people should leave us alone. You know, that's not the kind of approach that we want. It is, of course, then you get the alternative view that Putin has been determined to fulfill a greater Russian agenda all along, regardless of what the West might, or NATO might or might not have done. And you can actually construct a case for showing that Putin certainly had ideas about that, and that some of the things he did very early on, particularly in Georgia, did indicate that he, as an ex-KGB man, he's never been reconciled to the Soviet Union's loss of the Soviet Empire. There's something in that, but you have to construct the conditions where it's more worth. Anyway, it's incredibly difficult to at the moment. We don't even know, of course, whether he has a united leadership group behind him, or whether he's dominating that by fear and intimidation. Occasionally, people suggest there might be a coup d'état against him. There are so many unknowns here, but we have to proceed on the assumption that he is somebody who can be negotiated with. And there again, we need to call on as much expertise and as little prejudice as possible. And concessions will have to be made to Russia. I mean, the problem with Syria, of course, was there was no negotiation there. And we left it too late. By the time that we sort of got to grips with Syria, Russians were already there. I don't think Russia is expansionist. I do think that Putin might be tempted to do adventurous things, and his judgment is not entirely reliable. But he's there. We have to deal with him. We have to try to understand him as best as we can. No easy answer, I'm afraid.
I believe that Pete might have a contribution to make. Am I right?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to draw your attention to an article I've just added to the Salisbury CND website about MI5 and Paul Mason, a whole series of leaked emails. I don't know if you've seen.
No, I haven't.
I think you might find it very interesting. In that it does, you know, I suppose we're all very aware that any discussion of diplomacy or any sense that NATO expansion could be a bad thing is stamped on by the government, and this is a very interesting read. I just thought I'd draw your attention, and I've put a link in the chat here. So.
I know that Paul Mason has got in. I haven't really followed this at all. I have seen one or two not uncomplimentary references to him recently. I thought it was quite a good thing.
Yes. Well, I think this certainly provides an alternative view.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah.
I thought I saw somebody. Did somebody pose a comment?
John Hills looked as though he might want to say something. I don't think he raised his hand, but.
So there is you put the link to Peter. You put the link there.
Yes.
But there's also a post from Linda. A long post. Has anybody seen that?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just reading it myself at the moment. And she has worked for the United Nations. Oops, I've lost it again. Let me just try and read it. A slow and painful process, less resources, yes. Yeah. My feeling is the UN peacekeepers and the Royal United Service Institute are better. Yeah. Yeah, she's right. I don't disagree. Yeah, I'm not sure what Linda is suggesting, but she's certainly right that I think basically she's saying the UN is not a very, doesn't have much vitality in these issues and tends to be reactive and subject to the member nations. Well, that's why the member nations should, in theory, get together. That brings me back, of course, to what I've been urging vainly on China. Here's the idea, my fancy, that China and Britain, as two members of the permanent members of the Security Council, get together and launch a peace initiative. It's not going to happen. But actually, why shouldn't it happen? Go back to 1954, that is actually what did happen. Premier Zhou Enlai for China and Anthony Eden for Britain got the Geneva conference, peace conference, going against the wishes of John Foster Dulles and with great Russian suspicion to settle the first Vietnam War. In theory, it could happen again. I might just add that living in this area, this part of Oxford and West Oxfordshire, there are quite a few retired British diplomats around, and who, by the way, to a person, were all appalled by Brexit and things like that, but also very much believe that diplomacy has to be given more a chance, more visibility than it has. Yeah. Well, I think that I'm not quite sure how one pulls together my vague idea of action. I think it may mean letters to one's MP at the least. But there's something in that, and perhaps resolutions to one's political party. Perhaps Oxford Labour Party should be discussing this. And Lib Dems likewise. Do you have any Lib Dem members, active Lib Dem members in the Abingdon Peace Group? I know
Me?
you. Yeah, I know you. You are. Yeah, good. Yeah, well, there you are.
I was going to ask John, have you tried talking to Layla Moran?
No, I've emailed her once or twice and got back a fairly standard reply, I think, but she must be. She has so many issues going at the same time. And that seemed to be the main problem with her. I know you had a dialogue with her not long ago, some time ago, didn't you?
Did.
Quite a positive one, yeah. But is it Barbara who's a Lib Dem member?
Yeah, I'm a Lib Dem. Yeah.
So
I think I'm not all that active. I deliver leaflets and I knock on doors and I do my little bit, but I'm kind of old.
But you could perhaps, Layla might listen to you as a party member.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, sorry, Mike.
No, I just wanted to say, I think I'm aware of two people who would like to say something. One of them is Annetta Bygott and the other is John Hills, I think. So Annetta first and then John. Perhaps take them in succession and then you can respond. John, I don't know.
Yeah.
See what they are first.
Yeah, okay.
Annetta, that's it. No, your sound went off and then went on and then off again. That's it.
Yeah, fine. I listened to lots of German talk shows.
Yes.
And I'm finding that very, very complicated, because when there's somebody from Ukraine present, they resent the fact that Germany has a pacifist development after the Second World War. And they insist that the only way to help Ukraine is allowing serious lethal weapons to be transported.
Yeah.
And I'm really lost. How do you square supporting weapons being sent into Ukraine, big weapons that might allow them to win, with, on the other hand, wanting a ceasefire immediately, the sooner the better? How do you square that?
Yeah.
I'm finding it really, really painful to listen to these talk shows, and very often there's a Ukrainian presence, and they would say, you Germans with your peace traditions, you won't even admire us for being willing to fight for our independence, when really we're fighting for you. And it's a terribly emotional climate that I find myself in all these talk shows. I can only share that with you. It's not a question. It's just telling you that it's easier for Britain, because they were on the good side of the last war, and they can quite happily see that this is an aggressive war from Putin, and it's even possible to say Putin is as bad as Hitler, and so on. So they happily deliver weapons. So do the Americans. They're more military. But we as Germans had this tradition that we wanted never again. Yeah. And this is a painful situation I find myself in. Thank you.
Shall we go straight to John Hills next now? Is that, would you like to?
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Mike. I'm a semi-retired clinical psychologist in the NHS. And having had a father who 50 odd years ago armed the warheads on Britain's Polaris submarines, I have a keen interest in understanding the psychology of fear, the psychology of terror, and how it is that it kind of freezes our rationality, and that we can look at the obvious and say, hey, why is this happening? My question to you, John, is about how do we combat the psychology, which I'm reading this currently. The way in which we are seduced by the macho sounds, noises, and actions of the strong man. And there are some strong females as well. One thinks of Margaret Thatcher, but there's something about our psychology that allows us to surrender to these nationalists, usually who promise the earth and usually use war or the threats of war, or certainly aggression, to ensure that they have an airing, and that those of us, all of us, I'm sure, on this Zoom meeting, who believe in the principles of democracy and willing consent, that they simply hijack the process. Any thoughts?
Sorry, I'll return to Annette, but I think I want to put the question back to you. I mean, you're a better place to answer than I am. Does the strong man appeal because he or she is compensating for our fears? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes, that's certainly true. They're like the strong father figure, or maternal figure. They create the illusion. I mean, Freud calls it transference. We transfer our fears and our trust in them. We place it on them, and that they manipulate and use that, or actually at some level they manage to believe that they are indeed what we think they are. But it's
well, it seems what you say is very interesting. And with Boris Johnson, because he puts on this performance of knowing what to do about Ukraine, that is in a way comforting, because we don't know what to do about Ukraine. And so he this expression, he's got the right call. He's played it. In fact, I think I heard a Tory MP saying Boris Johnson has played a blinder on Ukraine. I mean, can you imagine it? But people think that. That is dangerous. And I don't know what to do about that. How do you deal with strong men? And we live in an age, as that book you held up tells us, where strong people. I mean, I think the word "strong" should be in quotes, because they could be very weak. In reality, Boris Johnson is, I think, a very weak person. They win. Yeah, well, that's something very much to think about it. And getting back to Annette and what Annette, your insight through the German chat shows, again, is something to think about. It's perfectly true that, it's actually true to an extent on British media as well. If you watch Newsnight, they have a succession of Ukrainian officials or spokespeople, some of whom have come over here to conduct various negotiations, and they never question critically. I mean, one obviously has enormous sympathy for Ukraine, but it should still be possible to say to a Ukrainian, "Don't you think you should recognize the likelihood that you're going to lose parts of eastern Ukraine, and time is not on your side, and no matter how much weapons we give you, short of direct intervention, which we can't believe you yourself think is sensible, you are not going to have a successful counter-offensive regain territory." I mean, if I was interviewing one of these people, I would try to put that as positive and unaggressive way as I could, but it should be put, but it's never put. That is a huge, and I think what you're saying is on these chat shows, the Ukrainians are not challenged even in the nicest possible way, because they're playing on this sense of guilt which we have. Is that true, Annette? Is that how it is? Are they on these chat shows? Is there any comeback to what the Ukrainians are saying? Is Annette there?
Yes, I think that I have the feeling that all of this really goes back to the Second World War.
Yeah.
Because really the Ukrainians were unfortunately the area in which two major powers, the Stalinists and the Hitlerists, met. Yeah. And they probably had to decide whether to be on the one side or the other side. So in a way, they're victims. But some of them were also quite happily supporters of Nazi ideologies.
Yeah.
And so when Putin says, I invaded Ukraine in order to fight the Nazis, then they say, well, the present president is a Jew. That doesn't come into it. It's going back to this history. And I'm really looking for a book that would explain what the situation in Ukraine was then, how it developed, and what it means for us today. I really find that that for me, it's history showing its rays into the future and into the present.
Well, I agree very much with that. And actually, I've just picking up a specific point the Azov battalion and neo-Nazis incorporated, so it is said, incorporated into the Ukrainian army. I mean, I haven't really seen a detailed forensic examination of the extent to which groups like the Azov battalion really are, if their ideology really is neo-Nazi, whether they are influential or not. So just on a purely factual basis, I have no idea whether Putin is sort of 10%, 20% or 30% or more percent right when he talks about Nazi ideology in the Ukrainian army. I just have no idea. We do need to have a much, as you say, a much better understanding, going back a very long way, going back to the Second World War. I entirely agree.
One of the shows that I saw talked about a statue, I think in Kiev even, of a man who had been a supporter of the Nazis, and that there were marches in honoring this. I mean, the statue has not been demolished. I can't remember the name now, but I mean, history is in it in a very big way. It's not just NATO and Putin. It's I mean, the people who live in the Ukraine are the children and the grandchildren of those who went through that terrible crash between these two absolutist, horrific world powers.
Yeah, and I've seen, I can't quite remember who it is or where it is. I've seen something from a Ukrainian political figure or public figure referring to that statue, referring to the neo-Nazis, what the glorification of features of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian history, which are pro-Nazi, and saying that he has, and other people have, protested loudly against this. So in other words, there's kickback in Ukraine itself against these tendencies. And again, one would have to know much more about that. But there does appear to be, at a political level, these issues have been fought over.
But what I do know is that the Donbas region was the industrialized region, and they were strongest on the Red Army side. And that's probably why they are so Russian friendly today.
Yes, yeah.
While further in the west, they would have been under the influence of the Nazis. So that it might explain why we have these autonomy attempts in the east of the country.
Yeah.
As I say, I really would like to find a book telling me all the whole story of that particular huge European country.
I'm afraid what we're saying is we all have to do rather more homework. And I see Linda's posted more about talk given to UNA at Cardiff by a professor who was brought up in the Ukraine and pointed out how mixed the population is. Yeah, we don't really have a clear idea of the strength of support for Russia in eastern Ukraine, because of course the Russians claim that it is huge, and they're probably going to organize some sort of fake referendum in the Donbas area. And the Ukrainians say it's very small, and the people who did support Russia are opposed to them now because of what's happened. It's clearly very difficult actually to get to the facts. I'd like to see, and it's not easy because it's a war zone too. We need to get a better idea of that really, because that would help us, of course, in any peace settlement to gauge the strength of support for an outcome which would leave Russia or Russian influence effective in those areas which, as you say, have been closer to Russia.
Yes, I think there may be a tendency for some to assume that because a person is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, they must support Russia, but that I believe is simply not the case.
Yeah.
I think it's important occasionally to mention that.
Yeah. Yes.
If nobody else would like to contribute, I'll just invite John to say a few final words of goodbye.
Well, I think all I would say is this, that I'm conscious we are sort of groping around for ways of expressing our concern that these issues should be approached in a more directed and productive way by, not least, the political parties with which we may have some connection. So slightly reluctantly, because it means I've got to do something, what I think on the basis of this discussion is I will fairly soon try to put together a quite brief sort of one side of an A4 sheet, a quite brief sort of setting out the issues which I think could be addressed, should be addressed by Leila Moran, Lisa Nandy, etc., etc., etc. And then if we circulated that, in other words, it was sort of my briefing paper to you on what one could most usefully say to people to try to take this forward. Would that sound a good idea?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Right. Well, otherwise, I'll just say thank you very much for inviting me again. And we've had a really good discussion, even if it's a difficult.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, John.